fact that I'm creating and building something from scratch, that feels like art to me, even if it is business.
Mm, that feels like art to me, even if it, say more about that. Art and
Well,
business, how those two
y-
creative instincts exist for you.
yeah, well, see, I feel like often entrepreneurship is separated from art because entrepreneurship is about business, right? It's about
Okay.
like making money. It's about doing something that has commerce attached to it. And that's true. All of that is true. But I have always found that when I think about my work as just being about business, it's less inspirational to me. And so I've always seen that every problem that I solve, every business that I start, everything I fix or build, like my work has always been somebody hires me to either fix something or build something, or I either like fix or build something on my own and then find somebody to pay me to do that. So my work has always been about like building things, making things, and I find that an artistic process, whether or not there's money attached to it or not.
Hmm.
And I should say commerce attached to it or not.
Yeah, yeah. Whether there's art or whether there's commerce, there's this creative um, problem solving around the businesses and working with people and solving problems, which
Yeah.
honestly sounds like kind of exactly what a producer of theater does. You gather people in order to create an experience or to say something specific or to solve a problem. And now, in a sense, you are assembling the infrastructure to make different programs happen all the time. Uh, can you?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the other thing about that I think is, I think it's often unfortunate when we separate out, okay, if you're gonna do business and be an entrepreneur, you have to go to business school, you have to have certain kinds of training, and there's only certain
Mm,
kinds of training that will teach you the things that you need to know. I think that's, a load of crap personally. Right. I think all of our experiences come with us to bring us where we need to go. And when I look back, I think the best training I ever had to be an entrepreneur was to theater produce, right? Because what do you have to do when you produce theater? You have to build something out of nothing. You have to find an audience for that thing. You have to sell that thing. You have to bring a bunch of people together who have different opinions and views, a lot of them very passionate and engaged in their way. And you have to build consensus with all of them. And you have to work to meet a common goal, you know? And that in essence is entrepreneurship. Right. And so every finance class I've taken, business class I've taken, any of those kind of things, yes, it's valuable and useful. But at the core, being a theater producer and learning how to do that has been the most valuable thing that I think I have ever done,
mm.
educational wise, right? Like to prepare me to do the kind of work that I do.
I think that's a good segue for what is the work that you do right now, which I know is multifaceted.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So I am at the helm of the DC Creative Affairs Office, which the mayor launched back in September of 2019. And our focus really is on building growth, sustainability of the creative economy, but we're focusing on three very specific areas. We're really looking at policy. So not just the policies that exist and new policies that we can create, but also policy awareness, right? You can have a policy that nobody knows that exists or how to use it. So I think there's some of it is also about the translation, and you should understand this from a communication standpoint, but the translation of something into something else that people can understand and then utilize. What's the point of having things, resources, policies that nobody else understands or knows how to use or take advantage of? So policy is one side of our work. We're also really looking at infrastructure, and we see infrastructure as not just about traditional physical infrastructure, like space, for instance, which is absolutely a valuable resource and necessary. And we're excited to be working on some space projects that we'll be able to talk more about as time goes on. But we also see infrastructure as a personal infrastructure, right? Like, what do you as an individual need to have for you to be stable and solid in order to do your best work? And so we're doing a lot of work in mental health. And so we have a partnership with GW that we launched a couple months ago that provides pay what you can mental health support for any creative or entrepreneur who needs it. And so I'm happy to share that information in the chat, which we're super excited about that. And then the other side of our work is really about economic mobility. And we see that as a conversation between saving money and earning money. So how exactly can you do everything that you need to do to be efficient in how you spend your money on your work? But then at the same point in time, how are we helping to prepare you to be able to earn more?
So it sounds like you're working from both the individual's experience of their creative professional lives all the way up to um, communal structures and also institutional structures that enable people to thrive.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I always think that at the end of the day, the end user is who I work for, right? Right. Like
Mm,
at the end user is the person who is getting those services, is the person that we serve, is that district resident who needs that resource, that support. And so in many ways, we have to make sure that all of that upstream work, all of that system work has to generate down to the support that the individual needs. If we say a bunch of interesting things that never actually helps the person down there, then all of that doesn't matter. So it's a constant conversation between making sure your goals and your mission and your systems and your structures are actually benefiting the people that they're supposed to serve. And so there's always that check-in process. You build a partnership, you build a strategy, you build a program, just making sure you're always connecting that. I'm always connecting that back to who's the person it serves. Because if it doesn't serve that person, or they don't use that service, or they struggle with that, or whatever it is, then we need to readjust.
I just want to, I'm like, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So good. So this leads me to the question of, as someone who has been part of um, the DC community, who has both, in your personal story, you've both been in the arts and you've worked in multiple facets of the city. You've met with individuals and communities all over the place. What are some of the major needs that you see in the individuals and the smaller communities and pockets of creatives right now? What is that challenge, and how would you dream of solving it?
Well, I think the challenge, there's scales of challenges, but at the core of them, the biggest challenge that I see is the connection point between people.
Hmm.
And this is a pre-COVID and a post-COVID challenge, right? They're slightly different in pre-COVID and post-COVID environments, but at the core, the connections and the community that you build and that you make, and the people that you connect with, will lead you to everything else that you need. And so I think often people skip over the process of building their community and making their networks in order to get money, right? Or to order to find, resources, or to find space, or to find all of those things. And when they leap over the process of finding the people, they make the rest of it that much harder, right? Because at the core, people don't give money to businesses, people give money to people, right? Like anytime you get any real money from anybody, people are giving money to people. That is the core of fundraising. That is the core of anything that you're doing when it comes to money, is that people like to give money to people. So if you don't, and that's just one thing, right? Like, and
Mhm.
knowing the right resource for you requires you to do the work to get to know people, to ask them, like, what resources have they used, how did they work for them, right? Like, so the process of building a community, the process of connecting to each other, not only helps you on your business side, but it helps you also build that personal infrastructure that we're talking about that you need. Because this work is hard, this work is lonely, this work is isolating, this work is exhilarating, this work is powerful, this work is inspiring. So, and being able to share all of that range of experiences and emotions require you to be connected with people who understand what the heck you do, you know because there's a lot of people who don't get it, and that's
Yeah.
okay. There's nothing wrong with the fact that they don't get it, but it does mean that you need to build a community around you of people who get it.
I just had a conversation with a client of mine about this. She was talking about how no one understands her work as an illustrator. And I was like, are you hanging out with other illustrators? And she's like, no. She's like, yeah, people don't think I work. And I'm like, no, I know that you work. But that, even in just that example of having someone mirror back to you, I see your work, I understand your struggles. They're not about you, they're about all kinds of other pieces of what it means to be an entrepreneur, to be a creative, to be an artist.
Well, that's powerful, right? Like even the simple act of having that conversation with somebody to reflect back to you
Yeah.
that you matter, right? That you're seen, that somebody else gets it is so, that like 30-second interaction can like sustain you for like quite some time. So finding the right people, I think should be at the beginning of everything, you know, and it's a consistent process that you have to work on, is to build those communities and have those conversations with people who get it. And then from there lead you to all of those other things that you need to, you know, to support your work.
And what you're saying about this also seems to me to tie back to the services you've been able to generate for creatives in the mental health space, because not being isolated and having community with people who are willing to support you and to see you and to mirror to you, that is fundamental to any stable mental health. Going from like a therapeutic relationship onto like your peer or a conversation like this one.
Yeah, well, and what's even better about the fact this program was created because of those kind of conversations, right?
Yeah.
Because like it's come up all the time where creatives for the past, you know, 3-4 years that I've worked for government, you know, I get in conversations all the time with creatives who are talking about, aside from resources and support like money and all this kind of stuff, the main thing they want to talk about is that they just feel like they need support in the mental health space. And so once all of this started, you know, and I've always felt like I didn't know what our role there was, right? Like I didn't, because I recognize our expertise is not in the mental health space. But it's always been sitting there being like, I'm not exactly sure how to help in this area.
Yeah.
But once COVID happened, I was talking with two creatives who I talk to all the time, a filmmaker as well as a musician, and they mentioned it yet again about how important it was. And literally the next day, I was talking with a friend of mine who is runs the counseling program over at GW. And she's talking about how COVID happens, her students don't have anybody to see. The artists are telling me that they need to see people. And it's like, well, it's like, here we go. But none of that would have happened if I wasn't having those kind of conversations. And and if it wasn't a safe space for those two creatives to tell me what they needed, you know. And so that's why I think it's so powerful to be able to develop the relationships with people in order for them to tell me what they need, and then me to go figure out how do I help that happen, you know. But can't do any of that if I didn't know those people. None of that would have happened.
This is why I call you the fairy godmother of the creative economy. So you are someone who is in those conversations and is able to connect need to resource, or most beautifully, two different needs that together solve something. The win-win. What does it look like to build those networks? How do we do it?
Yeah, I wish I could have a more profound answer to this, but I think the answer really is by saying yes to the conversations, right? Like being a good listener. You know, a lot of times people listen in order to figure out what they're going to say, right? As opposed to listen in order to actually hear what somebody else is saying. And so I think this process of being a really good listener and being available to talk to people and to listen to them is how this happens, right? And also being endlessly curious. I mean, I'm endlessly curious. Like, I like being around people who know things I don't know. Like, I prefer to be the one who knows the least about the subject in the room most of the time, because then I learn the most that way. So my curiosity, like, I'm just an endlessly curious person. And I think being able to foster that kind of curiosity makes you show up in rooms that you may not have previously thought you would be in, because you're looking at your life and your goals too linearly. And I'm kind of like, this is that creative in me who's sort of like, I wonder what's happening over there. I'm gonna go over there and find out and listen to those people and talk to them for a little bit. That was cool. That's interesting. And then I go over here. So it's this process of really enjoying talking to people, right? Like, I love to talk to people. I love to listen to their stories, and I think that's the core of it, because once you do that, then it's just about putting the pieces together, you know. And my brain just does that, right? Like my brain loves to play the puzzle and to be like, oh well, that's that, and then that's over there, and they're a little slow on the uptake, but I bet if we put them over here, we can like bring them in the back end, and then they can do that, right? Like I could do that till the day is done. So it's just the matching game really requires me to listen to people.
What's something you're curious about right now?
Well, I'm wildly curious about this is going to be so boring. I'm sorry, but I'm wildly
No.
curious about system development.
Yeah.
So from the perspective of upstream, right? Like I'm really, really
You
curious
talked about
about.
this in your newsletter.
I did, yeah. I'm wildly curious about upstream work, right? And the process of how you take your downstream work and you jump it up, right? Like how you jump it up. And so I'm constantly thinking to myself, right, the work that we're doing, is this getting at a system level, right? Like how do we get to the system level of the challenge and the problem, and the systems and the structures around the creative economy, and specifically I think in the nonprofit arts sector, there's a lot of system challenges, you know. And so I've been spending a lot of time like listening and reading and learning about how to get at some of the system stuff. So like the nerd in me has been really digging into that.
I love it. I want to jump back to something that you had said just before I asked you this tangent about curiosity. One of the things that you had said about how do we build these connections, which was to be open to the conversations and to be curious. Those were kind of the 2 points that I heard. And I immediately thought of how I got connected with you, which is that someone said, I was telling them about my work and they said, do you know Maryann? And I said, no, I don't know who this is. They said, well, you need to know Maryann, and you need to know 202 Creates. This is their email, meaning 202 Creates, the plural, industry singular. Contact Maryann. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And I cold emailed you, did not expect to hear from you, honestly. And you wrote back and said, would love to meet you. Come down to my office. We'll have a conversation. What are other things that you have put into your life that you know makes it easy for you to say yes to those connections? Or what are the decisions you've already made so that when someone reaches out, you're like, yes, I'll connect with this person, or yes, I know that I would want to engage in this way. Because it was an open door for me. There was so much generosity in you saying, I'll come talk to you come down, talk for 30 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. I think we ended up talking an hour. But that generosity from you opened so many doors for me on a personal and relational basis in the DC community. How did you even decide to say yes to that? Like what made that a yes for you?
Well, because you're a priority, right? Like the reality is that we prioritize our time. That's what we do. We all wake up in the morning and we prioritize what it is that matters to us during a day, you know. And we may do that subconsciously or we may do that actively, and I try very hard to do that as much actively as I can. And so when I prioritize what matters to me, talking to you like matters to me, right? Like that bumps up other like stuff I may have to do that I just don't think is as valuable. And so and that's always the case when it comes to talking to creative people, entrepreneurs, any of that kind of stuff, partly because you guys are endlessly fascinating and I love you, and partly because I learn an enormous amount, right? Like I learn as much from you as that you may get back from me, because I can't do my job if I don't know you. So it is a really like it's a continuous relationship. But I think the reason is that like you matter. You're a higher priority than other things. Like anybody who reaches out like that, like you bump up to the top of my list of other stuff.
I hope for everyone on this call, this encourages you to reach out to strangers more often. who are doing work that you find interesting and that you care about, not because they have something that you need. I didn't know what Maryann did at all. So this is an aside. We're breaking the fourth wall. Hello, audience. I didn't know what Maryann did exactly, other than that someone told me that Maryann would be worth connecting with. And that reach out has been endlessly delightful for me. And so I hope that for the people here, they can imagine that someone on the other end of their email might have them as a priority. So that's an aside. What was your question in the cold email? I think it was, hello, I live here. I do this thing. Can I meet you? It helped that Maryann's job is to connect with people like me. So it was probably a little more relevant than that.
Well, and the other thing I think that is interesting is that a lot of people don't reach out for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You know, and so when people do reach out, I'm always really excited about that, because it is, so less common than you would think. And this is why I give my cell phone out to everybody, because the amount of people who actually take me up on the offer to, text me or email me or whatever is quite small. And maybe it's because I'm scary, maybe it's because it's government, maybe it's because whatever it is. But so when people do actually reach out, I'm all game.
And I would add to that their reach out doesn't have to be, it wasn't a pitch from me. It wasn't saying, can you get behind this thing that I'm doing? It was simply out of curiosity on my end too. I wanted to know about 202 Creates, and I wanted to know about you.
Yeah, and we ended up having a great conversation.
Yeah, we talked about, what did we talk about? We talked about language, the power of words. Probably, because that's what I always talk about.
Because that's what you talk about.
That's my thing.
Yeah.
I'm working on my next question. I'm working on forming the next question. So one of your biggest challenges that you see on the individual level is this connecting with people. Speaking specifically to artists and creatives in COVID time, what does it mean to build community right now?
Yeah, well, I think that at the core, in many ways, it means the same thing it meant before. I think previously, pre-COVID, building community often felt like it had to include some big, huge networking event, and people had to come together and have an event attached to it. And I think one of the things that this process has shown us is that when you strip all of that down, the work is really one-on-one, right? And that's slow, and people don't like it because it's slow. But it's true. The work is really about that one-on-one process. And so I think being able to allow this time to teach us that we really can, even if it's literally just saying, once a week, I'm going to find and connect with somebody that I haven't really talked to before, or I'm going to reconnect with somebody and make that a part of your workflow. I think that's how you build real relationships. And quite honestly, that's the way it worked before, because you would go to those big events and you would meet 800 people, and then you would come home and feel really crappy because you didn't make a connection with anybody, a meaningful connection. Maybe you made a meaningful connection with one or two people, and then you would follow up with this one or two people. So you don't necessarily need the 800 to follow up with the one or two. So I think there's an opportunity here to just start putting that process in your workflow and see where it leads you, without having too many boundaries around it, right? Because if you say, I have to meet this person for this thing because of this goal, this is where I'm trying to go. It's great to have goals. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't have goals and a mission, because I'm a highly mission-oriented animal. But I do think when you're meeting people, is to just be a little looser with that and just try to find people that you think are interesting. Somebody you heard in a talk that you think is interesting. They said something that perked something, like reach out to them, you know, or an organization that you're interested in connecting with or knowing more about. Just reach out to that one person. Yeah, that's what I think. People, man.
I feel fully amen and underwrite the prior statement. Reaching out to people I don't know is my favorite thing to do. I know that it's hard for some people, and I'm like, but they might be cool.
Well, it is hard, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that it's a simple process, but I do think that more often than not, the people who respond want to hear from you. You know, it's like, we want you to succeed. Like, people, like, we want you to succeed. And that is actually something I really like about DC, is that I find that there is there is a really honest feeling that people want you to succeed here. And I've lived and worked in environments that have not been like that. So I think that's such a really good thing. And so even if it is like DMing somebody, but then try to get that past the social space, because the social space is wildly limited. So just
social media.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, please
Okay.
get it out of the social media space and get it into an actual face-to-face conversation with somebody, or getting on the phone or something like that. But yeah, because people want you to succeed.
How do we know people want you to succeed, but how do we know how to be in relationship with people to, like, even let them know what we might need to succeed? Or is it just being in the conversation and, like, staying curious and hearing from other people? Like, how do you stay in touch with both what you need and what your community and networks are in need of?
Well, I mean, I always know well, those things are a moving target slightly, right? Like once we hit, so for example, like the mental health space, like once we know that that's a need, then the process is making sure that our partners are still getting served the way they need to get served in order to, like, move that thing forward, staying connected with the community that we've been talking to make sure that that service is still needed, you know. And so that's just a constant process of staying connected with people, right? So it's just a relationship building and partnership building at its core, you know, and that requires you to just keep in touch with everybody, right? Like, it's the same thing you'd be doing if you had a customer. You know, you have a customer, you sell that customer a product, and you're keeping in touch to see whether, especially if it's a service, you're keeping in touch to see whether or not that customer is still utilizing your product or your service. And if that customer isn't utilizing your product or your service, you want to know why. You want to reach back out to them and say, hey, what's going on? Is there anything? Is there a way I can help you? Do you have a question? Right? You stay in contact with that person, and then that person will tell you, oh, well, I don't really need this anymore. And maybe they've grown out of that service and are moving on to something else, and that's fine. Or maybe the service is just not quite tailored to them, and there's something you can do to adjust to help them. So this process serves everybody involved, right? Yeah. And it's not I mean, it's a totally honest process, right? That's what we do. We need to be in touch with people to make this thing work, right? You can't just push play and be done. This work is a relationship between you, the business owner, you, the service, and the customer. It's the same way of art, right? Like in theater, at least, because that's that constant feedback loop, right? You're putting something in front of an audience. The audience is going to have an opinion to that, and you're going to have a reaction to it. Sometimes you'll adjust, sometimes you won't, you know, because you're having a relationship with your audience. So it's the same kind of thing.
So I'm going to mash up a series of quotes that I can't remember where they come from, but I heard this line that change moves at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust. So in some ways, what we're talking about is the slow and the building of trust between individuals and networks and communities and systems, to do meaningful work, to do creative work, and to keep our heads above water financially. Like, those two things are intertwined. So there was a question that someone asked specifically about trust building. And as a creative who can have very diverse and divergent thinking patterns, or even communication, how do we build trust with people outside of our spheres? For example, someone like an engineer who might think very technically or systematically. You have very adaptable thinking structures, but for a creative who might be in a more maybe stereotypical creative thinking pattern, what does that trust look like when there's so much difference between our industries?
Yeah, well, I think the first part of it is to stop seeing people as a representation of their industry and seeing people as a representation of themselves, right? Like you can have, like, engineers can be wildly creative, and science people, policy people are often, when I talk to them, are often like fascinated by talking to people who think differently. And so I think we suffer a lot from categorization, where you say, I am an artist, so therefore only artists understand who I am and understand how I think, and that's just not true. So that's the first step of it, is to stop seeing people as labels and see people as people. And then just starting the conversation. I mean, we had this conversation before everything started. There's this painting that's behind me, and this painting is a reproduction of a classic Renaissance work that was done by a bunch of science students at the University of Massachusetts Amherst through a class that an artist taught science students how to reproduce famous artwork. And the point of it was to get them out of their science brain and into their creative brain, and to help them see things from a different side. And it was wildly successful. I mean, all of the feedback after these classes were the science students would go back, and they would go back to their work and be like, wow, it just unlocked something for me. It just made me think about something in a slightly different way. And I think that's always a potential when you connect people who seem like they have differing ways of looking at the world together. And quite honestly, we all need to be talking to people who don't just think like us, right? Like we all need to be open, to having broader conversations beyond the labels.
Broader conversations beyond the labels. That is a tweetable. I'm not on Twitter, but I assume that that's the content of a tweet. This leads to another question that someone asked, which is, if we're looking at trust and we're looking at seeing people for who they are, rather than the role or what they have to contribute, how do we find investors as artists and creatives? The startup world has the VC culture.
Yeah.
What does it look like to look for funding and support and investors? Is that a thing we should be pursuing?
Well, it's always a thing we can be pursuing, but there is a reason why it starts with the friend and families round, right? Like most. Okay. But there's a reason, and granted, there's also a lot of accessibility and equity issues that surround this idea of friends and family round. So yes,
that's my issue with it. I'm like, you say friends and family, I'm like, but where did you grow up? What did your parents do for a living? Like, friends and family might not have deep pockets, people.
True, but the relationships that you build can lead you there, right? Just because just because mom and dad don't, aren't coming with the change, doesn't mean that your process in developing relationships with people won't lead you to somebody who's interested and excited about you and what you do. It can't be not having parents who are wealthy can't be the excuse to not develop relationships with other people who are excited about what you do. There's lots of systems and networks, especially here in DC, to connect around meeting people, and expanding the venture capital space, and, whether it's through the pitch environment, whether it's through other organizations, whether it's through networks. So I think that friends can be, broadly speaking, it's just networks, right? Like, it's building those networks in order to lead you to those places. And then on the system side of it, we absolutely need system change, right? Like, but while system change is happening, it's on the responsibility of those smaller organizations and those startup folks to start trying to build the networks that help lead them to what would be a friends and family round. But there's a lot of equity and access issues within the startup space, especially for women founders and founders of color. And I mean, it's not great. But that still means we still have to get in there and try to build the relationships that help us get past that while the system work gets changed.
Yes. Okay, this is a spicy question.
Bring it on. Like a little spice.
How do you balance creating the art that you want to be making and making your art a profitable business?
Yeah, well, the first thing I always ask people, which they often they try to skip over this step, is the art you're making, do you actually want to sell the art you're making? Right? Like, some art isn't meant to be sold, right? Your relationship with that art doesn't always have to turn into a business. There is a little bit of this like pressure that exists that somehow you have less value as an artist or creative if you're not out there, you know, hustling and grinding your way to selling your stuff. And the reality is, you actually can choose to do your work and not sell it. That is just as valuable a choice as taking your work and selling the snot out of it. So like, I think that's always the first question I ask people in this, is to make sure that you actually want to do it. Because if you don't want to do it, you're going to find ways to fail. So make sure you know you want to do it. You know, and then the second piece of it is to find, like, who's the audience for what you want, right? Like what you're selling. You know, and that's another thing that often gets skipped, is like, is there an audience for what you're trying to sell? You know, we can't, just because you love it and you like it doesn't necessarily mean there is a market for that thing. So once you know you want to sell it, you want to investigate that kind of thing, the next step is to figure out, is there a market for what I have? Does anybody want to buy what I have? And if there is, then there's a whole other steps you can go down to sell and figure out your ideal customer and get a business plan and, you know, do all of the things that you need to do. But you can't jump over those two steps to start with. Is, do I actually want to sell it? And is there actually a market to sell it?
I think another way of asking that question, do I even want to sell it, is, what does success mean for me? What does meaningful art making look like for me?
Sure.
And selling is one expression of that. It's one facet of that larger question of, what is this work actually for? What is my work actually about? Maryann, I don't know if you can see the chat, but people are like falling over about the line, like, if you don't want to do it, you will find ways to fail.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's not a bad idea to find to distill it to that, right? Like, because often if we think too romantically about it, it's very easy to miss the sort of like core. So finding a way to distill it in that kind of a manner kind of helps you knock yourself in a little bit and be like, okay, like, what do I really want? Because you can't get to what you're talking about the whys and the hows and the whatevers, if you don't know what you want. It's the first W of any process, is, what do you want?
Yes. What are you actually trying to do? What is it for? Who is it for?
Yeah.
And in this process of relationship building, so let's say, Helen just asked in the chat, if there is a market, if you do want to sell it, how do you find your people? Which is another way of talking about like that relationship building. Like, how do you find your people? Either to buy from you or to be your community. Like, there's so many different roles that people play in our lives and that we play in their lives. Like, it's not a one-way conversation.
Sure. So if there's a market to what you're doing, so there's two kinds of people, right? Like, you know, there's your people, which are the community that are going to support you on this journey. And then there are your customers, who are also a part of your people, but they're your customers. And there will be some overlap between those two communities, but it's good to recognize that they are different, you know, because as you are building out a business, the process of doing that, it's good to have your community, your network of people that will support you as you go through the journey, that you're not also trying to sell to, because that changes the dynamic a little bit. And yeah, and so when you are and it also will you'll have a hard time seeing who your actual customer is if you're only selling to your friends, right? So you have to be able to figure out how to separate those two communities. And then when it comes to you figuring out who your customer is, that's a whole other process. The first thing that you need to figure out is you do need to figure out your why, who, what, where, how, right? You need to go through that process. You need to figure out the answers to those questions. And then you do need to figure out a business plan, and you do need to have revenue streams, and you do need to figure out what my multiple revenue streams are. And you do need, I mean, like, you'd go through that process, which is not necessarily rocket science, in the sense that it's a pretty standard process of figuring out, like, what I do, who's my customer, how am I marketing to them, like, what's my story, you know, and then you start that process, right? Like, and so but it's important to separate out those two different communities.
Yeah. So we have time for a couple of questions if people wanted to unmute and ask a question that way. If you go to the participants tab, you'll see your name and you can click raise hand. And I'll see that here in the participants tab. And if you would like to be unmuted and ask a question, you can. Or if you have remaining questions and you don't want to unmute, feel free to drop them into the chat. I'm also going to, at this point, while people are mulling on their questions, Maryann, I'm going to drop your links and information. So this will take you to Maryann's website and different Instagram locations. I mentioned earlier in the conversation Maryann's newsletter. She's doing a project of a letter a week that are these fascinating reflections, sometimes interviews, resources to other opportunities and ideas. That's really, really wonderful. So I've enjoyed reading those this year. And you can sign up for those at MaryannLombardi.com for the Human Capital newsletter. Leon, let me unmute you. Please ask a question.
Am I unmuted?
You are
okay,
unmuted.
Great.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. One quick question on, I had a question about theater. There seems to be a trend now towards the Zoom plays, and I was wondering, how do you view that? Is that a viable medium now? And as someone who's got a couple of plays that I want to get out there.
Yeah, no, thank you for answering that question. So my child did their first Zoom theater thing this summer, which was fascinating to watch, right? Like, fascinating to watch how they did that. And I think that there is a interesting opportunity with Zoom to be able to develop work that is specifically for that platform, right? Like, I think translating something that is really meant for the stage into the Zoom platform is probably not all that viable. But being able to tailor to what Zoom does well, there's a level of intimacy that you can get through Zoom. There is a level of being in somebody's home that I think is really interesting from an experiential perspective that I think theater can take advantage of. There are, I can't remember the name of this company, but I remember reading about it back in June. I'd have to go back and look, and I can send it to you. But who was doing this project, this theater project, where they were, you would sign up and you would pay, and then they would mail you something, right? Like, there was an experiential part of this theater experience. So then when you would do the show, you would have this box that would arrive at your house, and there was stuff about it that you would have to utilize in the theater experience. And it was fascinating. So if you email me, I'll look it up and find it and send it to you. So I do think that there is some interesting opportunities there. Great. But it requires you not to take something that should be on a stage and just stick it into a Zoom environment.
Maryann, there's another question. How do you feel about the podcast boom for business and creatives?
Well, I think it's definitely a boom. I think that it's an amazing marketing tool. I think that, like any other content, if you can commit to it and be regular at it, it's going to be valuable to you. I think part of the challenge with all of these different content channels is that everybody's trying to do too many of them all at once. And so in that, they're having a hard time committing to producing the amount of content that they need to produce to make it viable and valuable and useful. And in order to monetize podcast content, it has to be regularized. So my suggestion for people who really want to make money on the podcast space is to make sure that they are absolutely focused on that podcast space in order to commit to creating content, in order to get the sponsors that you need, in order to get the listens that you need, in order to then be able to monetize it in any sort of significant fashion.
Oh, I love that. We're getting some more theater questions in the chat. I'm gonna wrap us up at this point. Maryann, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This was a wonderful conversation. I learned so much in it. Thank you everyone for being part of DC Startup Week this week. There are more talks in the creative economy track coming to you this afternoon at 4:30. There is a panel that will continue this conversation of how do we connect to people. So the topic is growing a generative network as a creative. The conversations are amazing. This talk has been recorded. It might go live at some point. We'll see. Thank you for asking that, Ariella. But please join us today at 4:30 to talk to 4 very different professionals and their very different approaches, but successful approaches to building those networks and communities that Maryann and I were talking about today. Some of you also were asking really beautiful questions about how to differentiate yourselves in the market. If you are interested in this topic, I am running a workshop this Friday at noon. We'll be talking about finding and defining the language for your work so that you can be seen and heard in the work that you're doing. So if you're interested in that part of the conversation, please join us at noon this Friday. And there are a bunch of other really phenomenal talks, and I hope you'll join us. If you want to download the chat, you can do so, because that has all of Maryann's information and her cell phone number, which she said you can call her at.
Call me.
Call Maryann.
Or text me. Text me is easier, but.
Yeah. I will also say I was very surprised when I got my first text from Maryann. I was like, who? We were both on a Zoom call, and she was like, hello, friend. And I was like, who are you? Love it. So download the chat at the little 3 dots at everyone. My information is also thrown into the chat. I will be here all week introducing and wrapping up conversations for DC Startup Week. Special thank you to Sabrina for offering beautiful ASL interpretation for us today. Reach out to me. I can't wait to be in conversation with all of you. Have a beautiful week.
Thank you guys so much.